Welcome to The Garrulous Gavel. I'm John Tico. My guest today is Matt Kaiser, the founding partner of the law firm of Kaiser Dillon, PLLC. We'll be talking to Matt about the January 6th Capitol Riots and a very interesting lawsuit in which Matt represents a member of Congress who has sued Donald Trump. We'll also be getting garrulous with Matt about his experiences as a door knocker for political campaigns and what he's learned from those one-on-one interactions with complete strangers. Hope you enjoy. Hi, I'm here today with Matt Kaiser. Welcome.
Hey, good to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, it's great to have you. So Matt is an attorney here in Washington, D.C. With the law firm of Kaiser Dillon. And we're going to be talking about a bunch of things today. We're going to start by just hearing a little bit about Matt's background and his very interesting legal history and how he got to be where he is today. And Matt is also involved in some of the litigation that has arisen out of the riots that occurred at the Capitol here in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. And we're going to be talking to Matt about some of the really interesting issues that have come out of those riots. And then we'll end with a little bit of personal stuff at the end, and hopefully it'll be a fun conversation.
Sounds great.
So let's start with a little bit about you. So where are you from originally?
I grew up in Iowa, in a very town of about 7,000 people, northwest of Des Moines, Perry, Iowa.
I have not been there.
Well, I'm glad to hear that for your sake. I mean, I like to see, Iowa's divided into two halves. There's the eastern half where everybody can read, and then I'm from the other half.
Okay. All right. So hopefully nobody from Iowa is will listen to this podcast. But
I guess I can't forward it to my mom now.
You just insulted half of your home state. But and then you went to college in Ohio, right?
Yeah, the College of Worcester.
Okay. And that's sort of a small liberal arts school.
Yeah, my dad went there. His parents went there. All of his brothers and sister went there. All of my dad's parents' brothers and sisters went there. My dad's grandfather went there.
So they pretty much had to let you in when you applied.
Yeah. I mean, my grades in high school were not great, but I think I had a pretty big leg up.
Okay, excellent.
It's interesting because, my son's looking at colleges now, and I both kind of want him to go to the College of Worcester, but I also want him to choose to go to the College of Worcester.
Yeah, that's a tricky dance that parents often play.
It is.
I really want you to go to my alma mater, but of course it's totally up to you.
Totally your choice. We'll pay for one. No, because that would be too much.
And what was your major in college?
Philosophy.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you went and got a master's in philosophy after that, right?
Yeah. So I did 4 years of grad school in philosophy. First at Tulane, then at the University of Maryland. And
was your intent at any point along that way to get a doctorate?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I wanted to be a philosophy professor.
And did you become a philosophy professor?
I didn't. I taught while I was in grad school. Yeah. But the hard thing, I don't know if I saw all these people who were some of the smartest folks I'd met go and get a PhD, and then they spent years just sort of surfing 1-year appointments through the Midwest and the Middle South. Yeah. It was really depressing. And at some point I wanted to have, a life and a family and be in one place.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I totally get that. That was part of my thinking in going to law school eventually as well.
Yeah. And the problem, of course, is that the boomers will never retire.
Right.
And they still haven't, right? They kept telling me when I went to grad school in the 90s, soon the boomers will retire and there will be all these jobs. And they still haven't left.
Yeah. I have two brothers who are sort of academic scientists, older than me, and they complain about that.
Yeah.
It's still true. And they're in their 50s and 60s now, and there are still people in their late 70s who are kind of running, some of the main institutions that they deal with. Anyhow.
It's amazing.
Well, but it's good that you have this background in philosophy, because maybe I'll ask you some philosophical questions as we go down, because I actually think some of this January 6th litigation is sort of interesting from a philosophical perspective. So you gave up the big money that you could have made as a philosopher.
I did,
and instead you chose the life of poverty of a lawyer, and you went to Georgetown, right?
Yep,
got your law degree there.
Yep.
And then what did you do after law school?
So clerked for a year for a federal judge in Maryland, Kathy Blake. She's great. She's an incredibly smart and incredibly kind woman, which was it was a great experience. So did that for a year, then left and went to Williams and Connolly, which was a very intense experience.
Right. And for people who don't know, Williams and Connolly is a big firm based here in Washington, D.C. that has a very good reputation and is a sort of a litigation-focused firm, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
And so they have a reputation as being one of the sort of top, very aggressive litigation firm that gets involved in a lot of, really big, hard-fought cases.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great place to see a certain model of being a lawyer. They really care about their clients. They fight very, very hard for them, and they work a ton.
Yeah, they get paid and get paid accordingly.
Yeah, and they have a lunchroom, which is cool. I mean, there's a paid lunch. If you work at Williams and Connolly, at least in the building they're in now, they're moving to a different building. There's a lunchroom where everybody gathers every day, and it's on the firm's dime. You pay taxes on it, but it was a kind of cool.
You pay taxes on it?
Yeah, it's a benefit. It's included as compensation because you have the ability to go and get a meal at the firm dining hall every day.
Because at the sort of somewhat similar firm that I worked at as a young associate, they also gave us lunch, but I don't remember ever.
Was it in the firm's dining room?
Well, we had sort of a multi-purpose room, and they would bring in lunch every day, like a buffet lunch, salad, sandwiches, drinks, whatever, fairly simple.
Yeah. And
anybody who wanted it. So it was effectively the firm lunchroom. And I would say on any particular day, maybe a quarter to a third of the attorneys would have lunch in there.
Wow. And it really was every day.
Oh, yeah.
Huh.
But I don't think they ever...
I wonder if they outfitted and deducted the cost. In a different life, I would have been a tax lawyer. I kind of wanted to be a tax lawyer at one point, but I took tax with Marty Ginsburg, Justice Ginsburg's late husband. And it was the intro tax class that people who really want to be tax nerds take. And, by, 45 minutes into the first class, it was way over my head. And I was just desperately struggling to keep up.
Yeah, you made the right choice.
Anyway, yeah.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. So maybe my old firm was just engaged in some sort of tax fraud scheme that I didn't know about.
Maybe, or it makes me worry actually, because at our firm, to entice people to come back after COVID, we don't want to hard require them. That doesn't feel like our sort of style. We're bribing them, and so we're going to have the firm provide lunch every Monday, and just encourage them to come to the lunch as a way to connect.
Right. Well, I think businesses do stuff like that all the time. I mean, we've always had a cabinet full of snacks and drinks that we just let people take. It would never even occurred to me that we should add the cost of the M&M pack onto people's W-9s at the end of the year and make them pay taxes on it.
You've got to divide the cost of the coffee machine by the number of employees.
If we did that, it might actually be like a good sort of dietary measure. It would disincentivize people from eating so much chocolate and drinking so much coffee. But anyhow,
talk to your health insurer. They might reduce your rates if you implement a scheme like that.
Okay, all right, we'll look into this. Anyhow, so you spent you spent a little time at Williams and Connolly,
and then left and went to the Federal Public Defender, not for the lunches. But I was an assistant federal public defender in Maryland for 3 years, which was in some ways a great job and in some ways an incredibly depressing job.
Was that in Baltimore or Greenbelt? Or? Yeah,
so my office was in Greenbelt, but I had clerked in Baltimore, so about half my cases were in Baltimore.
Okay. Yeah. And so for people who don't know, what does a federal public defender do?
Right, sure. So if someone is accused of a federal crime and they are indigent, they're poor, they can't afford a lawyer, then generally the federal public defender comes in to represent them. There's some exceptions to that, but that's the general rule.
And I'm assuming that something like 80 to 90% of your clients got off, were found innocent and set free, correct?
It's amazing. Yes, that's exactly not the experience.
Right. So I, as you may know, I also clerked in the District of Maryland coming out of law school, and I remember watching the criminal cases come through. And I was a law clerk for 2 years. Probably 100 criminal cases or something like that during the time. We had a 100% batting average or 1,000 batting average. Every single one of those cases pled guilty.
Yeah. I mean, that's the problem.
And as far as I can recall, the only fights that ever occurred in those cases, and this is going back to the early 90s, so maybe things are different now, or maybe not. But at least at that point in time, the only fights in those cases were about the sentencing guidelines, whether people got this credit or that credit under these complicated guidelines. At that time, lots of drug cases, and the sentencing guidelines were very harsh. And I remember thinking even at that time, although I didn't really understand that system very well, that really the reason that 100% of the cases pled guilty, I mean, maybe it was because the U.S. Attorney's Office in Maryland only charged guilty people and never made a mistake. But I sort of had my doubts about that. It seemed to me that there was just these enormous institutional pressures that were brought to bear on people, that if they went to trial, they were essentially penalized for claiming that they were innocent.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I remember I was at sentencing one time with a guy in a drug case where the judge, I was at a plea, where the judge has this standard set of questions they have to ask if you want to plead guilty. And really the point is to make sure that that you're doing it of your own free will, because you're giving up important rights. And so the judge asked my client, has anyone threatened you or coerced you in any way into taking this? And my client, who had an excess of candor, said, yeah, absolutely. That lady over there, the prosecutor, she threatened me. And then she threatened you? Yeah. She said if I didn't plead guilty, they'd go to trial and then I'd get another 20 years. And the judge said, oh, no, that kind of threat is okay.
Right.
What I meant was, did she threaten you with violence? And he said, well, no, it's just with the sentence. But, of course, when you think about it, they're going to put him in a cage. And if he walks out of the cage, they will do violent things to him. It's not quite true that they didn't.
No, that's right.
Threaten him with violence.
I mean, I'm trying to think back. This is going way back in my memory. But from what I recall, there was a part of the sentencing guidelines was that you could get, I think, what they called cooperation credit.
Oh, absolutely.
Am I remembering this correctly?
Yeah.
And basically that credit reduced your sentence quite dramatically. Mm-hmm. But what that meant, what cooperation credit meant, was that you just admitted that you were guilty and didn't put up a fight. And if you said, no, I'm not guilty, and you fought, then you were not cooperating.
Well, so there are two kinds.
Is that right? Am I remembering correctly?
There are two similar kinds of credit, right? So there's acceptance of responsibility, which means you're admitting that you're guilty, and then you get a number of levels off depending on where you fall in the guidelines.
Yeah. Which makes no sense. How can it be that admitting that you're guilty gets you? I mean, it just shouldn't operate that way, right?
I mean, I think the theory is that if you're repentant, that you'll be more easily rehabilitated by society while you're in the custody of the Bureau of Prisons.
Okay.
I think there's good reason to be skeptical of that. It could just be that you're a skilled tactician. The other kind of credit, cooperation credit, is when you become a cooperator. You provide evidence or testimony against somebody else. You become a snitch. Mm-hmm. And, so it was interesting when I was a federal public defender. My Baltimore cases, it was right during the time that The Wire was coming out. Mm-hmm. And so for years, I didn't watch The Wire because I felt like it was my day job. Mm-hmm. But the whole cooperating, the whole snitching culture is just fascinating because in the Bureau of Prisons, most people have at some point been accused of being a snitch. And almost everybody denies it almost all of the time. But it's a ton of folks, right? Like there are just a lot of cooperators in federal prison.
And so that's still the system for the guidelines?
Well, so when I was in the office, a case called United States versus Booker came down, which meant the guidelines not mandatory, they were instead discretionary. So a judge had to look at the guidelines and had to consider them, but didn't have to follow them as harshly as I guess when you were clerking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we had room to move. Now, the problem is judges had been used to the guidelines for forever, and you still want to do what you're used to. And so most judges followed the guidelines in the beginning. That, I think, has loosened over time. But it has led to this really regrettable situation right now where, there are some jurisdictions, Maryland, for example, follows the guidelines pretty regularly. It'll depart from the guidelines or vary from the guidelines, but it does it less easily than in D.C. for many of the judges there. Mm-hmm. So for the same exact offense, and you know this, you can be on, right. I live I don't know, 50 feet from the DC border.
Yeah.
If someone's walking down Eastern or Western Avenue, depending on which side of the street they get arrested on, can matter. It can be a 5-year difference in the sentence they get for the same crime.
That was the raison d'etre of the guidelines in the first instance.
Absolutely.
To try to smooth out those sort of judge by judge variations so that you didn't have the hanging judge right next to the really nice judge down the hall. And, that was to try to make things fair from the perspective of defendant to defendant.
Yep.
And the guidelines did do that, I think.
That's exactly right.
But the guidelines themselves may not have been sort of tuned correctly.
Right. If a 10-year sentence is an unfair sentence, it's probably not a step towards fairness that everybody gets the unfair 10-year sentence rather than just, what some random set of the people getting the unfair. I mean,
that's an interesting philosophical question, right? Like, if we're going to give unfair sentences, should we give them to everybody, or should we have random exceptions to the unfair sentence to make the people who get the 10-year sentence feel even worse about the system? I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question.
I think it's a great question, and it's a great question about what we mean by fairness and sort of the philosophy of fairness, right? Because there are two things. I mean, one is the crime relative to the time, sort of in absolute sense. Mm-hmm. Whatever that means. Mm-hmm. And the other is what it means relative to other people who've gotten it. I mean, it's sort of like how you determine prices, right? Is there a market that determines the price of, coffee cups? Mm-hmm. Or is there some sort of natural price for coffee cups that's out there? Mm-hmm. I mean, the Romans had that view, right? Where in Rome, they would set the price for goods and dictate what, like an urn of wine was going to cost. I don't know if wine came in urns.
Soviets did that too.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. What are you suggesting?
Is insane, right?
So you're suggesting that the penalty for a particular crime could actually vary by time and location based upon sort of local conditions.
Well, I think as an empirical matter, it does, right? I mean, if you committed the same crime, I don't know, stealing, right? Stealing $100,000 or goods equivalent to it. If you committed that crime 2,000 years ago, almost anywhere in the world, the sentence would be more draconian than it is now. If you committed that crime in East Africa, the sentence would be much more draconian than it is here. Mm-hmm. If you committed that crime in Europe right now, the sentence would be a lot lighter.
Well, but how would you apply that within the United States? So, I mean, it's almost like a federalism kind of question. Sure. It's sort of like, should we let local conditions dictate the penalties for crimes, or do we want kind of a national uniform set of rules? And I guess we sort of have a hybrid system now because we still have federal crimes and then we have state crimes. And the state crimes are not uniform, right? That's state by state.
Yep. I mean, what's interesting is that the federal crimes, you've seen over the last, 50, 60 years, the federalization of crime. I mean, some areas, Baltimore City for a long time, the U.S. attorney took the position that Baltimore City had just failed to meaningfully prosecute for a wide swath of crimes and just took it over. And so they would come in and do gun cases because they felt that, so for a lot of gun crimes in Baltimore City, they felt if someone had been treated too leniently and they'd been through the system too many times, they were just going to take those cases.
And prosecute them under what law?
Oh, sure. So generally felon in possession.
They would prosecute them as federal crimes.
Yeah, prosecute them as federal crimes so that the punishments are not sensitive to local political pressure. Mm-hmm. Which is an interesting question for federalism.
Right.
Why would you think that would be? Really what you're doing is you're immunizing the prosecutor from the will of the people who are affected by the prosecution. You can imagine U.S. attorneys' offices would feel differently about that. They would say that they're protecting people when they're, but you could see both are important ends that could be served in a different way. Sorry, I got us hung up on
No, but this is a very interesting. I mean, this is not what I was intending to talk to you about, but this is super interesting.
Sorry.
So how long were you at the public defender's office?
Sure, 3 years. 3 years.
And then you went back to private practice?
Yeah, so then I went to Zuckerman Spader, which is I guess, mid-sized boutique now. It's not really clear what boutique means in the legal world in D.C. anymore.
How big was the firm when you were there?
I believe they were about 90 lawyers.
That's sort of boutique by DC standards. In Iowa, that would probably be the biggest firm in the state, right?
That's probably right. That's probably right.
Again, local conditions dictate.
Exactly. Yes.
And you went back there as an associate for a couple of years?
Yeah, so I was there for about a year and a half, and everyone was fantastic. They were very nice. I got to do really interesting work. But I realized at some point that I'm a horrible employee. People would come in and ask me to work on things, and I had been a federal public defender where I kind of ran the show. I mean, the nice thing about being a federal public defender is you have your cases, and you run them. You work with your client. You just don't have. There are people you can go to if you've got questions, and they'll kind of talk to you about your case, but they're not going to direct how you do it.
Right.
And when you move to a firm where clients didn't hire me, they hired somebody else. That person kind of wanted to direct how I did the legal work, and I preferred not to be directed. So
let me ask you, how did that manifest? Like, did you actually have fights with partners about how to handle cases, or was it more just kind of like a grumbly discontent?
Oh yeah, I mean, I wouldn't even say I sort of saw where the ground is, right? I wouldn't say I was a problem, employee. I hope. I haven't actually asked anyone if I was. I just realized that I wasn't enjoying what I was doing, and that at some point I'm going to die, and I should do stuff that would be more fun.
Yeah. I remember having a conversation with you, and maybe it was around this time. I don't know.
Yeah,
I can't really remember exactly when I met you, but it was in one of your law firm stints, I think. And I remember you were sort of ruminating on career paths and sort of thinking about what would it take to just go out on my own?
Yeah, sure.
And so you did ultimately decide to do that. So when you left Zuckerman Spader around 2009, is that right? And at that time, what did you do?
Sure. So I started a law firm. I started the firm June 1st. I think that was a Monday. I gave notice, whatever, a few days before that was. It was great. I mean, I remember those as the kind of wonderful good old days. My wife remembers those as the times when I was working all the time and incredibly stressed out. Both can be true.
Yeah.
But yeah, I remember I left Zuckerman at 5 and went to my first meeting with a potential client at 6:30. I had rented this horrible windowless office with the carpet was dusty or moldy or something, and it really aggravated my allergies. But it was super cheap, and I was paranoid about cash flow.
Right. And was it just you, or did you leave with partners?
Me. No, it was just me. I was a true solo for about a year, and then hired the first employee who was a lawyer / admin. And then, hired a woman to come in as counsel, and then we sort of grew from there. And
so the current iteration of your firm is called Kaiser Dillon LLC.
Yes.
So maybe just tell me a little bit about sort of what that firm is, what it's become, and kind of what your current practice areas are.
Sure. So right now we've got 14 lawyers, which feels bizarre, whenever I say that in reference to the early days. The carpet is clean and nice. It doesn't aggravate anybody's allergies. Actually, in my office, I've got sealed concrete, just to be extra careful. And I like the look. Because that's what you want to know about the flooring in my office.
Well, that kind of stuff is important. Do you put rugs, or you just go right on the concrete?
I've got an area rug.
Okay. Yeah. All right. But that you can take out and get cleaned every now and then. You don't have to worry about the dust. It doesn't build up over time. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
No, it's a nice idea.
Yeah. It was actually cheaper than the carpeting flooring.
So is your whole firm concrete, or just your office?
Just my office.
Nobody else wanted it, or you didn't offer it to other people?
I offered it to the other partners. Nobody else wanted it.
Uh-huh.
There's every now and again, there's a decent amount of, that's just a thing Matt's doing.
Yeah.
Which is cool. Whatever.
I mean, but look, if you're going to have your own business, there has to be some perks. And if your perk is, I want to live in a concrete cell and work out of one, then you should be allowed that perk. It's
in solidarity with my former clients who are Yeah.
Exactly.
Although, like my partners could have done the same thing. Would have been happy to have many concrete floors, but alas. Right. So, sorry, 14 lawyers. And we do virtually everything we do is litigation with one exception. My practice winds up being a good bit of white collar criminal stuff. And I can talk about what that means if you'd like. I do a fair bit of legal ethics work, and that can be pretty varied. I've been an expert witness a few times. I do some advising to law firms or clients, do some malpractice litigation, things like that. And then I do these sort of other cases, and I don't really know how to describe them other than they're sort of like others, like the January 6th case. We were involved in a voting rights case in Georgia that was very exciting. But cases were, generally it's that I know lawyers who are involved in it, and it seems like it would be fun to do.
So let me ask you this question. Do you think that the practice you have now, would you have been able to sort of build an equivalent practice if you had stayed either at Williams & Connolly or at Zuckerman Spader? Or do you think that sort of going out on your own kind of led you in a different direction in terms of your sort of the scope of your practice?
So I think there are two questions there, right? So the first is, could one have built that practice at Zuckerman Spader or Williams & Connolly? And I think the answer there is definitely, right? I mean, Williams & Connolly and Zuckerman Spader both have pretty big practices in both areas. And I did both kinds of work when I was at both firms. Whether I could have, I don't know. I feel like going out on my own was really an accelerator for that. What I thought to myself when I started the firm is business development seemed really important as a lawyer. Getting clients, figuring out how to do that. And I didn't really know how to do it, and no one teaches it in law school. But if my ability to pay for my kids' college depended on learning how to do it, I'd probably figure it out. Especially if my son wanted to go to Worcester.
That's definitely true.
Yeah.
Go ahead and tell me a little bit about white collar criminal defense. What does that mean for your practice?
Yeah, sure. So it winds up meaning a couple of different things. In its classic sense, it's people who are accused of the kinds of crimes that white collar people commit. Generally crimes by businessmen or business people. Sort of FBI investigations into many different species of fraud. And I've certainly done that and do that. What I think it also includes, or we wind up meaning to include within it, is are cases where there's serious allegations of wrongdoing. It may be that there's no prosecutor involved. It may be there's no investigator involved. But there's a serious threat, and if things really break bad, they could go there. Or where there's an investigation or an allegation of misconduct that where prison isn't really the fear, or prosecution isn't the fear, it's just serious reputational harm. My partner, Bill Pittard, who I know you know, came from the general counsel of the House of Representatives. It used to be I would do some congressional investigations work where, someone comes to the attention of a congressional committee who feels like making some headlines. Now we've got Bill. Bill does that kind of stuff, but I think that's generally within the broader ambit of white collar criminal stuff. And what's cool about doing that here in DC, right, is so much of our work is either political Washington or federal Washington. It's a lot of people who are caught up in the political process. Our firm, and I've got 3 other partners who do very similar sort of variations on the same work. During the mini Trump investigations, I think we had somebody in every investigation of any consequence, which was kind of cool, right?
Right. That's a venerable old Washington, D.C. practice to represent just people who have been swept up in political investigations of various sorts. Yeah. I mean, when I was a young associate, the Ken Starr special prosecutor, is that what they called him? No, independent counsel. Yeah. It was the old independent counsel law, right? Yep. He was the independent counsel, and there were a bunch of independent counsels. They were all over the place, investigating like almost everybody in the Clinton cabinet. And so that was a very active and profitable business for defense lawyers. It was representing witnesses who had been called to testify by these various independent counsel.
Although it also can be super depressing. I mean, we represent a lot of federal employees. Mm-hmm. I remember you remember the Lois Lerner sort of tax. So Lois Lerner ran the nonprofit and I think state government unit. Is that it? She ran a part of IRS. And there was an allegation that many people said was false, like, Inspector General's reports and congressional reports said was false. But it got a lot of attention that they were discriminating on the basis of ideology and the status that they afforded nonprofit organizations. Mm-hmm. So, all right, like huge investigation. Now, we had a number of people in that in different places, but one of our people, who was an IRS employee, fantastic woman, like the legal fees for that could just crush her as a federal employee. And, the difference was if she went to another firm that was larger and more expensive at that point, it's an interesting question how much we're closer to that now, she would lose her retirement. If she came to us, it was a matter of losing a vacation.
So,
which is like heartbreaking, right? Like that somebody is just a career civil servant. They're doing their job. They're doing it the best way they can. And merely because Congress has a lot of questions and someone is making political hay out of something that the federal government did, which of course, like that happens every Tuesday. Someone is going to lose this financial security that they have worked very hard to have.
I suppose a question that somebody from the outside looking in on that might ask as well. Look, she was just doing her job. She didn't do anything wrong. Why did she need a lawyer? Why couldn't she just go testify?
Yeah, no, she of course could and had the right to do that. It's impressive to be in a proceeding in Congress where someone's trying to make score political points off of you, because a lot of the questions are unfair. Often you're not given a chance to answer. And one of the things, I think in those kinds of cases, we do a couple of different things. We add value in a couple of different ways. One, we really prepare someone to answer questions that are just grossly unfair. I mean, there's the classic, have you stopped beating your wife yet? Like that is an example of a friendly question when you go to the congressional context, if they've decided they're hostile to you. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. The other thing we can do is we can kind of get between the person and those kinds of questions. And sometimes we can, provide the information without having the person themselves go and have the conversation. Mm-hmm. So, you would hope that the world would be such that someone could merely come and tell their story. But the truth is not self-reporting. And sometimes people need help getting it out there.
All right, good. Interesting stuff. So you have a fun, interesting practice. You've built seems to be a successful, thriving law firm
so far. And could get indicted by the end of the year. Who knows? It's a crazy world.
If that happens, I know some lawyers that you could hire to represent you.
You're very kind. And I don't yet know of a reason why I would. I should probably.
So let's switch gears and talk about the January 6th riots and the litigation that you're involved with arising out of that. So just to kind of set the scene a little bit. So what we're talking about here is a series of events that sort of culminated on January 6th of 2021. Mm-hmm. We're now sitting here. It's roughly the end of the end of July 2021. So we're maybe 7 months removed from these events. But there was a fairly violent riot that occurred at the U.S. Capitol that involved both a fair amount of property destruction. The crowd sort of violently pushed their way into the Capitol building. Lots of people were hurt. One woman was shot and killed as a result. And there were some number of police officers who were injured or killed.
Sure. Yeah. A number of police officers were injured. One died. There were 4 Trump supporters who died. And when you listen to, so today is the 27th, the first testimony by the police officers before the House happened this morning. I don't know if you caught any of it, but a lot of what they described was just terrifying, right? I mean, it was really hand-to-hand combat for a number of hours over whether people get to sack the Capitol.
Right. And so there has been some civil lawsuits that have been filed as a result of that. I think there was at least one case that were actually brought by some of the Capitol police officers.
Yep.
And there have been cases filed by members of Congress.
Yep.
And you represent one of those members of Congress, Eric Swalwell. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct.
He's a congressman from California, I believe. Yep. So just tell me in your own words, what is this lawsuit about?
So really, so we sued 4 people. We sued the former president, Trump, Rudy Giuliani, Donald Trump Jr., and then Mo Brooks, who's a member of Congress from Alabama running for Senate. What we're trying to do is hold those folks accountable because we think they caused the riot at the Capitol. And if you read our complaint, we talk about them causing it in 2 ways. First, with the Oath Keepers, with the Proud Boys, with the people who came with bear spray and grappling hooks and weapons and who had pre-planned this. The ones who were very active on web pages like, the Donald.win, or other social media places where very right-wing people hang out. Our allegation is the defendants who we've sued conspired with them to attack the Capitol and prevent Representative Swalwell and others from doing their job as members of Congress. And then there's another part of it that is like once those people were in place and were conspired with to come sort of attack the Capitol and open it up, the people we have sued, the president and his friends, incited a riot. They whipped up the crowd that was there, that was drawn to Washington by the president's tweets and words and the actions of a whole bunch of people. And they got them to march on the Capitol and rush the Capitol so that once the grappling hook and bear spray people had sort of penetrated the perimeter and had the combat with the cops and broken windows and gotten into the Capitol, there was this mass of humanity behind them that came and allowed the storming and the sacking of the Capitol to happen. That's, in a nutshell, that's what we allege.
And to just give this a little context, January 6th was the date on which this occurred. For what reason?
Oh, sure, because that's the day that Congress was supposed to certify that Biden had won the Electoral College vote and would become the president.
Okay. So let me ask you this question. What do you, from your perspective, what do you think Trump was up to in the sense of like, what was he trying to achieve through this?
I think he was trying to stay in power.
You think it was that simple?
Yeah.
Like he really had a plan or a hope. If it wasn't a plan, maybe it was a plan, that he was going to actually be able to stop the certification of the election.
Yes. And then he would stay in power through, it's right. It's like the South Park episode, right? Step 1, act, step 2, act, step 3, profit, right? Like yes, I think his plan was to just keep injecting chaos into the process because he knew if the process went along smoothly, he would become he would lose the presidency.
I mean, sitting back, like looking at it, I think some of us who are sort of not part of the hardcore right wing world, have a hard time understanding kind of that mindset.
Yeah.
And so it looks a little crazy from the outside sometimes to the point where it's almost hard to take it seriously. I will say just talking from my own perspective, looking back on that day, the events that unfolded were very surprising to me. I didn't see that coming. I mean, I had been reading about this rally. These people are coming, blah, 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 blah. But Trump was having rallies all the time.
Sure.
And the end result of this particular one was to me very surprising. When the first time I remember like turning on the TV and all of a sudden there were these people climbing up the walls of the Capitol, and there was that video clip of the Capitol Police trying to hold people back at the door, and they're and the people setting up the noose outside the Capitol. I mean, all of that was in the moment very surprising to me. And then I read your complaint, and now looking back on it, and you can kind of see how things led up to that point. But it was hard for me in the moment to sort of take Trump seriously. I think because I had become sort of inured, if that's the right word. Is that a word?
Sure.
One you don't use very often. But like Trump was always spouting about something crazy, and it was the lie of the day, the conspiracy
Sure.
of the day, and I never took seriously the possibility that he actually wasn't going to leave the White House. I guess I had sort of played with the idea, and obviously people were talking about it, but the idea that would actually happen still seemed, even then, far-fetched to me. Like, it seemed to me that just there was so many institutional barriers to that happening in our country that at the end of the day, he was going to have to leave. And that what Trump was really doing was just the same thing he always does. He was just stirring the pot, trying to get attention, trying to dominate the headlines, being the big guy in the room, all of those things that he always did. But this idea that he was actually going to hold on to power always struck me as far-fetched, sort of until that moment when like things turned violent. And that was like the first time that it dawned on me, like, oh, maybe there's actually something much more serious going on here.
But first, I mean, look, that's a beautiful statement of faith in our democracy. Right? Like, and I don't mean that in a condescending way or in a glib way. Like, I do think it is beautiful just as a matter of citizenship, as a matter of who we are as a country and as people, that so many folks had that background assumption and belief. I think that's absolutely fantastic and admirable. And I think one of the things that's most depressing about the riot and so much of what's happened in the last 5 years is that, to a certain extent, people who had that belief lost faith in it, or could in retrospect feel foolish for having it. But and that's that's depressing. I mean, what a loss. When you think about your kids and you think about what we are as a country, it's really that it's just I think it's profound to me and keeps being profound how much that's the big injury on the country. I mean, the loss of life is horrible, right? The desecration of the Capitol. I mean, if you talk to people who've worked in, say, the Senate, right? No one goes on the floor of the on the floor of the Senate unless they're a member, or on swearing-in day, a member of the family, or very important staff. And talking to Senate staffers about seeing people on the floor of the Senate, and it really is almost as sacred, if not just as sacred, space for them and for our republic. But I feel like those violations are the really lasting and damaging and troubling ones from that period. So as somebody and I don't mean that to minimize the loss of life or the property damage or anything. I just But I think that so let me ask you this question. You sort of studied this series of events more carefully than most people, probably, thinking about building this case that you've brought, which we'll come back to in a minute. Sure. I think there's more to say about that. But from your perspective, how close do you think we actually came to like a constitutional crisis? I mean, what would have had to have gone differently? Look, I think if Mike Pence had decided that he was going to buy the Trump line, that he had the power not to certify the results, we would have been in a full-blown constitutional crisis. Right. So from that perspective, we came really, really close. It basically came down to one person, or maybe a very small number of people, who just could have stood up and given a different kind of speech. Yep. And if you look at the TikTok in the Capitol, right, of when the rioters were outside the Senate chamber, I mean, if that had gone ever so slightly differently, well, things could have had serious loss of life. Yeah, things could have been even worse, just from a violence perspective that day, if the Capitol Police hadn't done a pretty admirable job. Right. Yeah. And it could have been that they prevented Congress from actually meeting that day, that if they had come in, and that was a very real possibility, right? I think that I don't think that would have been as big a constitutional crisis as if Pence had refused to certify, but it would have been a big deal.
And so if you look at it that way, it feels to me now, like I feel like I learned something that day. Like to me, because I agree with you, I think we were actually pretty close. Yeah. To a major crisis, and one that I had kind of poo-pooed on January 5.
Sure.
By the end of the day on January 6, I was like, oh, we came pretty close to like something pretty bad here. And it feels to me now like we're not quite out of the woods, because we're still in this, these challenges to the counts, bizarre and off the reservation as they are still happening in some of these states. Yeah. You still have what appears to be a majority of the Republican Party still, at least implicitly and sometimes explicitly, backing up this idea that there was massive election fraud.
Yeah, they believe the big lie.
And so it feels like we're not quite out of that woods yet. Like something could still break in the next election cycle or something like that.
I think that's right. And I mean, the scarier one that I see is in a number of states, there was pressure on state legislatures that were Republican controlled to override the will of the popular vote and send electors who would be Trump supporters. You saw that in Pennsylvania, saw that in Georgia, I saw that in Michigan. The state legislatures in Georgia and Michigan have now given themselves the power to do that. So, fast forward 3.5 years, if the results come out the same way, but you've got just enough political cover around the big lie that those state legislatures can override the will of the people. Like, I think then we're in a full-blown constitutional crisis.
Yeah. So with all that as background, what do you hope to sort of achieve through the lawsuit? And I guess before you answer that question, I should ask you a little bit more questions about the lawsuit itself. Sure. So the plaintiff in the lawsuit is a member of Congress. Right. And so why is that the plaintiff?
Sure. So the first cause of action we've got, a suit under the Klux Klan Act, in 1985, subsection 1, which I'm sure every listener of the podcast is super excited to go look up now.
Well, it's actually kind of interesting. Explain right? What it is.
Yeah. I mean, it was passed back during the Reconstruction era, when really basically mobs of people were going in and preventing governments, mainly state and local governments, from doing their jobs as governments. And so they created a cause of action so that you could sue in federal court and invoke the power of a federal court to right that wrong. What we're saying is that this is basically that's the right statute to handle this conduct for much of it, right? And so when Trump summons to Washington, D.C. his followers with the bear spray and the grappling hooks, and they all coordinate and go into the Capitol together, that is not meaningfully different than the Reconstruction era activities of, white supremacists back then who wanted to keep progressive politicians from coming into office. And to do that, what the statute says is it's elected officials who have a cause of action under that.
Okay.
People who are going to be functioning in government. So
that's the real.
And also, Eric Swalwell was on the Capitol that day. He was in the House chamber.
Sure.
He suffered a real injury by, watching a violent mob come in who wanted to kill people, among whom were people like him.
And in addition to that claim under that statute, you have some other claims for emotional distress and some other theories that are kind of more sort of tort-based claims, right?
We've got common law claims that are and some D.C. statutory claims, right? So inciting a riot, there's a political bias statute in D.C. We've included that. Those are sort of, for a general audience, the big baskets of claims that we've got.
Right. So all right. So let me ask you this. So the riots happened. We're now 7 months past it. Many of the actual participants in the riot are now criminal defendants. There's been a lot of criminal charges brought against the people that were able to be identified from the video and so forth as having actually participated. So what would you like to see as the outcome from your civil case, and why do you think that whatever that outcome will be, why do you think that that would be an important thing to try to achieve?
Sure. So first, I think lawyers know this, right? That the remedy you can get from a lawsuit or from the law is almost always incomplete. You see this in a car crash, right? If someone's in a car crash and they lose a loved one, money is never going to bring them back. It never makes them whole. You get as close as the law can get you. The damage that was done to that, like, kind of beautiful sense you articulated at the beginning of this part of the conversation, that, money's not going to fix that, right? And so what we've asked for is money, and we've asked for injunctive relief. We want the defendants, if they're going to have a rally on a big election-related day, they've got to give notice so that we can go and we can try to get some kind of injunctive relief so that we can insert ourselves into the process of trying to make sure this doesn't happen again. Will that completely fix all of the problems? Of course not, right? But I think it does two things. It gets us closer, and it holds accountability. It holds the people who did this accountable. Mitch McConnell, who is really no political ally of Eric Swalwell in any sense, said during the impeachment when he voted to acquit Trump that there are a lot of other ways to hold someone accountable in this country, and one of them is a civil lawsuit. And, we saw that. We took him up on the invitation. A civil lawsuit, even though the remedy is going to be inadequate, and even though it's going to be incomplete, and it doesn't change what happened, it's how we hold people accountable in America. And so that's what we're trying to do. Yeah,
I guess the way I think of it is that there are certain types of legal rulings or legal victories that are symbolic, but that doesn't mean that they're not important. Like,
right.
Sometimes,
that's
sometimes
right.
Symbolism really matters, and it matters particularly in the political realm.
Yes,
I think.
Yes.
If this was purely a business dispute, and you might be like, well, and in fact, if it was purely a business dispute, the courts probably would not pay much attention to it, right?
Sure.
The rules around injunctions are, well, we're not going to issue an injunction against something that's never going to happen again.
Right.
And here, yes, in theory, they could hold another political rally. Maybe it's not theoretical. Trump's not president anymore, and so forth. But in this realm, it does seem to me that you're right, that there is there's something more significant about the symbolism at stake here. And I guess, to be determined. I understand that one of the sort of legal issues that's being litigated in your case has to do with standing and sort of what the remedies might be and so on and so forth. So that's all to be determined.
Yep.
We're still in early days for the litigation.
Absolutely.
But I totally understand your point. So a lot of your case is sort of about causal chains. And
isn't every case?
Well, a lot of law is, right? And I think this is sort of a recurring issue. As you know, every law student, what's the one case that every lawyer has read at some
Paul's
point?
Graph, right?
Paul's Graph, which is this case from for people who don't know, it's this case that was decided, I think, in the 1920s, and it's this sort of bizarre fact pattern, and happens to have an opinion written by Benjamin Cardozo, who was a famous judge. But it's all about this question of sort of what counts as causation and who should be responsible for a somewhat strange sequence of events that leads into somebody being hurt. And so a lot of I imagine sort of the defenses to your case, at least, I assume there's a lot of detail to these legal claims and various defenses that could be raised, but it's sort of like a high level of generality. If somebody were to sort of attack your case, they might say, well, all that Trump did was talk. It was just protected First Amendment speech. He sent out some tweets. He gave a lovely 75-minute speech that maybe a couple of times he said some words he shouldn't have said, but the overall gist of the speech was just political talk. And so he wasn't responsible for people going and doing crazy things that he didn't tell them to do.
Sure.
So how do you how do you kind of respond to that sort of high level kind of maybe critique?
Yeah, I mean, I think, especially on the conspiracy claim, that I feel like that just doesn't touch us as a legal matter. If you and if right now I said, hey, let's go rob a bank, and we pull out our phones and we look at where the nearest bank is, and you say, yes, that sounds great, let's rob a bank, and we synchronize our watches and we agree we're going to rob a bank at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. Mm-hmm. All we've done is talk. It's nothing but speech. We have also completed the crime of conspiracy to commit bank robbery.
Okay, but just to play devil's advocate,
sure.
Right? In your example, there is an actual discussion of the robbery of the bank, whereas in your complaint, there's no allegation that Trump ever explicitly said, let's go ransack the Capitol and attack people inside the Capitol. Agree or disagree?
Go to the Capitol and I'll go there with you.
Uh-huh.
I mean, the words you just used right now, I don't believe he used those specific words, but I think he used words that get you as far. But look at the antitrust conspiracy cases, right? Where you can have, I mean, as I suspect you've done antitrust conspiracy work.
A little bit.
Yeah.
It's not my bread and butter, but yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Look, and antitrust law is really cool and really interesting, and I think the causation arguments there are really interesting and cool too. But you can have, if the argument is you've got 2 or 3 competitors who are coordinating on prices, what'll happen in a case either by the Department of Justice or a civil case brought by people who are harmed by that price fixing, if it happened, is they'll talk about public statements. It may be that, all you've got is like one round of golf where the 3 or 4 people who make the pricing decisions for those competitors met, and you have no idea what they talked about on that golf course. But you've got public statements about price information. You've got public statements about, here's where I see the market. And if this happens, that'll happen. And this is how market share will be allocated if people make different decisions. You can prove there's never a time where they say, or you get an allegation that they say, hey, everybody raise your prices. Nonetheless, that can successfully state a claim. That can successfully prove an antitrust price fixing conspiracy. And so let's note 2 things about that, right? One, a conspiracy can be implicit. It can be inferred from the facts. And if you go into any criminal courtroom in America where they're trying a conspiracy case, you will hear a judge instruct on that. You will see juries all over America finding people guilty beyond a reasonable doubt for conspiracy charges where there was never any express statement where somebody said, hey, let's go rob that bank together, or let's go, distribute this heroin together. A conspiracy under the law doesn't have to be express. It can be implied and it can be inferred from the facts. And I think when you look at the stuff we put in the complaint, when you look at the train of social media activity, the call and response between Trump and his followers, I think we meet the test that the courts apply in a garden variety way across a whole swath of conspiracy law. So first,
okay,
that meets the test for conspiracy as an implied conspiracy. Second, all of that is speech. A conspiracy really just is speech. It's a speech kind of crime, right? It's a contract. It's offer and acceptance. And no one in their right mind would say that the First Amendment protects conspiracies, right? It just doesn't. In the same way that if you go into a bank and you say, yes, I would like a mortgage, I make $4.5 bazillion, can you please give me a mortgage? You can be prosecuted for bank fraud. There are a whole bunch of things where the First Amendment just doesn't extend that far because it's not speech, it's action. And that's kind of and I think that's what undergirds the First Amendment, where the First Amendment falls in response to the conspiracy allegations.
So taking that theory kind of to its logical conclusion, I guess one of the questions that I have in my mind is the FBI and the Department of Justice have been pursuing lots of criminal cases relating to the riots. At least so far, from what I know, those cases have all been directed against individuals who were physically part of the riot, physically breaking into the Capitol and doing some crime on the Capitol property. All right. what is your sense of whether the criminal cases are ever going to kind of extend out beyond that, right? Because from what you're saying is that their criminal liability doesn't attach just to the final act of, in this case, violence or destruction of property. It could extend to other people who are kind of part of a conspiracy to commit that act. Do you think that there's anything going on the criminal side that will ever extend beyond the actual rioters?
Well, there are two questions there, right? So I think the question you really need to be asking, not to be presumptuous, is like, will this hit the people we've sued or people close to them?
Well, that would be the obvious targets under your theory, right?
Not necessarily, right? I mean, you could see. Whether there's criminal liability raises a set of a couple of different questions. And, of course, there are a lot of discretionary decisions that prosecutors make about who to prosecute. And
right, it might never happen. But I guess I'm sort of, when I read about the prosecutions of the individual rioters, it does feel to me like there's almost a little bit of unfairness there. Not that those people shouldn't be prosecuted, right? But if you accept the premise that they were essentially acting at the behest of and the goading of the man who at the time was the president of the United States, right? There does seem to be some, I don't know what it is. I feel like there's a little bit of unfairness of putting those people in jail if that's what's going to happen. Whereas the person who was kind of pushing those events, organizing those events, goading those people on, is not subject to any sort of criminal penalty.
Yeah. No, that seems unfair.
And you think that's just going to be how it's going to be? Like, I mean, sometimes things are just unfair, and you just have to live with it.
Sometimes things are just unfair. I see the argument. I think building a criminal case against the president, you could see some challenges with that.
Yeah.
I can't remember if these have been prosecutions, but I know that there's been talk of prosecutions. I don't know every rioter case that's been indicted, because there've just been a lot of them.
Yeah.
But I had thought someone was prosecuted because they weren't at the Capitol, but they were planning for it.
Yeah, I think some of the people that were part of these sort of right-wing groups.
Yeah, who were coordinating, like the guy who goes and buys the zip ties in bulk at Costco, I guess. I don't know. I think some of those folks have been caught up. Although I do see that that's kind of not. That's a different issue than what you're talking about. So
let me ask you this question, kind of going back to the First Amendment issue. How much of your position about the First Amendment issue hinges on the fact that Trump's claims about the election fraud are false? And just to give you sort of the counterfactual, imagine a world where an election actually was where the outcome of an election actually had been impacted by fraud or by some sort of outside interference. And so that we knew that an election, in fact, had been stolen from the rightful victor. And if that rightful victor stood up and gave a speech and said, this election has been stolen. Again, let's stipulate that that was true. And your democracy is being destroyed, and real patriots have to take the country back by any means necessary. All right. Would that make a difference to whether or not that speech is sort of First Amendment protected?
So, we'd be in a situation where legal process, the constitutional order, would get the wrong result. And so the question then would be, can you conspire with or incite people to upset the constitutional order? And to some extent, right, like that I guess is the position of the people during the Revolutionary War, right? Mm-hmm. The king had a whole lot of power. They didn't like the way the king was using that power. And so they got together to, sort of violently reject his rule. You can't do that in a lawful way. That's just illegal. You don't get to try to overthrow the government if you think that the lawfully ordained result is the one you disagree with. That's just kind of not how it works.
Right.
And if that starts being the rule, then what are we?
Yeah, I think the answer is sort of, if you are going to take the law into your own hands and stage a revolution, you have to win. No, I mean, I'm serious. And if you don't win, then all you've done is incited unlawful conduct. I mean, that's really what it comes down to, right? Like the American Revolution from the perspective of the British was unlawful, I'm sure.
Yeah.
In whatever language they would have used in the 1700s. Right. That's why they sent an army here to put down the revolution.
Sure. Yeah.
But within an established constitutional order, you can't have that kind of conduct, right?
Right. Yeah. No, it's extra legal, right? I mean, it's like the civil disobedience cases. I mean, it feels like every time there's a big protest in Washington, D.C., someone calls because they were arrested after, refusing to do something that was a lawful order, and they want to use the civil disobedience defense.
Right.
Well, the reason civil disobedience has its moral force, I mean, obviously, I think civil disobedience is a radically different category morally in just about every way than violent insurrection at the Capitol. But the reason civil disobedience has moral force is because of its illegality. Mm-hmm. If you've got a civil disobedience exemption or exception or defense, what's that?
Mm-hmm. Right. So if you're going to protest by doing something illegal, you have to take your medicine. And maybe as a society, we say, that's okay. You can protest. You can even protest violently. We're going to put you in jail for a little while. And then it's up to the public to decide whether that was worth it or not, I guess. Right. In other words, that sort of, this is your point. Like, the power of civil disobedience is the fact that you are acting unlawfully.
Right. I think that's where its moral force comes
and maybe
from, right?
maybe you should do that peacefully. As Martin Luther King would have had it.
For a whole lot of reasons, you should do it peacefully.
Yeah, but sometimes things get heated, right? I mean, in protests, things get heated, and sometimes it's not always peaceful. And that maybe that's, I'm not offering this as a justification for what happened on January 6th. Let's be clear about that, because I think the real problem in the series of events, and I think your complaint actually does a job of really laying this out in a really powerful way.
Thank you.
That the events of January 6th did not occur in isolation.
Right.
Like, that ground had been sowed and seeded for months leading up to that. And that's the really scary thing, right? Like, this idea that the election was rigged and was a fraud was something that Trump was pushing even before the election happened. Yeah. Right. He was sort of like hedging. Right. Like, I'm going to win, but if I don't win, it must be fraud.
Yeah.
And then as soon as he didn't win, fraud. And a lot of people believed him. Anyhow.
Yeah.
All right. So we've talked a lot about your case. I think it's very interesting. We'll see how things play out.
Thanks.
So what is the current status, and we'll sort of looking forward, into the future a little bit. What do you think is going to be happening in your case? And I take it that there's some other related cases as well.
Yeah. So there are two other related cases. Right now, we have filed our oppositions to motions to dismiss. The defendants, in our case at least, have until the middle of August to file their replies to our oppositions. A number of amici have come in, weighing in on our side.
That's interesting. Who are those?
Sure. So there are a number of them. Constitutional Accountability Center has an amicus brief. There are some law professors who have an amicus brief on First Amendment issues. There are a number of other law professors who've got an amicus brief on 1985 and how it should be interpreted. There's a lot there. Yeah. Congressman Brooks filed a motion saying that he should enjoy the protections of the Westfall Act. Basically, without going too deep, because I know we're talking to a general audience, if someone is if you imagine you get hit by a postal delivery bus or postal delivery truck, and you sue the driver will file a motion saying, I'm a federal employee. I was just acting within the scope of my employment. I was doing my job. You really want to sue the government. You don't want to sue me. Mo Brooks was saying he's basically a postal delivery man who was just doing his job as a member of Congress by inciting a violent riot to overthrow Congress. are filing an opposition to that request later today.
Okay. And who's your judge?
Amit Mehta.
Okay, so we should be looking for a ruling sometime in the next few months, maybe?
Yeah. We'll see how he wants to handle these issues. Yeah, we'll see how he wants to manage the docket in the 3 cases.
And it does seem to me, in just kind of reading through the papers in the case, that there are just a bunch of legal issues that are either novel, just because these are some statutes that are not interpreted frequently.
Sure.
Or are novel because it's such a novel factual circumstance.
Right.
And that sort of leads me to think that, this is a case that's going to go up to the DC Circuit. You're probably going to have appellate rulings at some point. Depending on how those go, somebody will ask the Supreme Court to weigh in. So you could be litigating this case for a couple of years, Matt.
Oh, yeah. No, yeah, I know. This will have a long life.
Yeah. And I guess the real question is, will it be over before the next presidential election? Right. Given the way that litigation moves through our system.
That's an interesting question.
Yeah. But, sometimes the value of litigation comes from some of these what seem in the moment like sort of arcane legal issues. Yeah. Particularly when you've got cases that are kind of on the edge, or that are kind of raise interesting new applications and so forth. Just that process of judges looking at these issues and deciding them, is kind of part of the legal system that we live in. Right. Just kind of getting these sort of new rulings, new clarifications. It sort of is a step towards the next case and the next case and the next case.
Sure. I don't necessarily think we're on the edge, except in the sense that there just hasn't been a lot of litigation over insurrections at the U.S. Capitol.
Well, right. I mean, that's what I'm saying.
No one sued the British in 1812.
Right. It's a novel set of circumstances. But I mean, for example, the Ku Klux Klan Act, I assume, is not one that has been invoked a lot in recent years.
Not been widely. There's not a lot of law on the Ku Klux Klan Act.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's interesting work that you do. I hope you think that it's fun and important, and we'll definitely be watching it carefully.
Yeah. No, I feel incredibly lucky to be in a place to be able to do the case, right?
There's something fun about being a lawyer in Washington, D.C. sometimes.
There really is. Yeah. There really is.
Well, when I do these interviews, I like to kind of let the guest talk about something a little more personal to them at the end. So it's not just all heavy legal stuff. So you gave me a few different topics, things that are kind of going on in your life. But I think one that would, really be interesting to people is that you do a lot of political campaign work as well as lawyering.
Yep.
And one of the things that you like to do is to actually go out into the field and do, what's called door knocking for political campaigns. And so I have done a little bit of work for a couple of campaigns in the past, but it's always been with kind of my lawyer hat on.
Yeah, sure.
Writing a memo about something, poll watching, that kind of thing. But I've never done this kind of door-to-door.
You've never knocked on a door?
I have never done that.
Oh, you got to come. It's fun.
Well, okay. So tell me a little bit about this process and kind of what the experience of it is. Because as I take it, you're usually sent out into districts that are close. Right. And maybe like places where, the election's going to be close and those kinds of efforts might actually make a difference. You're not going to do door knocking in New York or something like that. You're going to go do it in some state that's going to be hotly contested.
Yeah,
right?
I wouldn't say I'm sent. I normally just choose where to go.
Well, okay. All right. So maybe tell me the process. How do you even get into this? How do you decide where to go? And then what is the experience like? Yeah.
So really any campaign that you want to door knock with will have you. They're always eager for volunteers. Really, the way I got into doing this is when I was 15. My mom ran for city council in a nonpartisan election in Perry, Iowa. And I went out with my best friend at the time, and we would knock on doors in our very small town. And the joke was, if we didn't know the person, if neither one of us knew the person whose door we were knocking on, Joe would pretend to be my mom's son. Because Joe was in the house a lot, he knew mom. And so, 6 weeks before the Perry City Council election, I just spent a lot of time walking the streets, knocking on doors, talking to people. And it was really fun. It's a weird human interaction, but a cool one. And then, so as I became an adult, I cared about political campaigns and cared about politics. And for the last several cycles but for the last several cycles have gone and just knocked on doors as a part of campaigns. And one of the
things presidential candidates.
I've done presidential. I've done congressional candidates. I've done some state candidates. Earlier I did some stuff in Maryland politics and knocked on doors in Montgomery County. What I like about it, and I don't know if this will resonate, but as you go through life, when you walk down the street in Washington, you see people you meet or you see people you don't know, and they have an image of you, right? And you're cloaked in your identity, and you kind of carry that with you. Mm-hmm. When you go home or you walk around your neighborhood, you're probably cloaked in an identity. It might be a little bit different, but it's still you. When you go and you knock on a stranger's door, like first you're on their turf, like you're very much on their turf, and there's some stuff around like physical appearance, right? Your race, your age, your gender, that people get right away, but everything else they just don't have, right? They don't know what you do for a living. They don't know what kind of car you drive. As soon as you start talking, they get more information about you. Mm-hmm. But you're in a real sense, you're kind of naked. Mm-hmm. And it's a cool experience to interact with someone where you need something from them. I mean, first you need just like basic kindness, mm-hmm. And a willingness to listen, and a willingness to engage.
And like, how frequently do you find, so let's say you knock on 100 doors, out of that, on average, how many people will actually talk to you?
So my daughter and I went out, the Virginia House of Delegates races are this fall. And again, I'd be happy to go knock on doors with you. And my daughter is 15 and I went knocking on doors when it was really hot. We knocked on 68 doors. We had a 26% response rate. So that's, 15 people?
That where you actually, somebody opened the door and talked to you?
Someone opened the door. We had a conversation. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was high, right? To be clear. Uh-huh. Yeah. And most people were already committed Democrats. Some people were leaning Democratic, but wanted to talk about the candidate and talk about the issues. We were knocking on doors for our House of Delegates race. Mm-hmm. And the gubernatorial election has gotten a lot of attention there. Mm-hmm. We talked to one Republican who was very, very nice. Mm-hmm. It's nice knocking on doors with a teenager because everyone wants to be nice to a teenager. And also it's good to spend time with your daughter.
Did you do this for the last presidential mm-hmm. cycle? So you did it for the Biden campaign?
Yeah.
Where did you go for them?
So I couldn't do it for the campaign, the Biden campaign, because the pandemic was not knocking.
Right.
So it took me a while to find somebody within driving distance of DC who was knocking on doors. But there was this group out of Brooklyn that was knocking on doors in North Philly. And so,
For which camp? For the presidential campaign?
Well, so it's a super PAC, so they're not...
But they're doing
They're not coordinating, but they're supporting Biden.
Right.
So I, starting in September, just every weekend would drive up and I'd get a hotel room and I'd spend the night.
Yeah, that must have been even weirder during COVID because people are probably very... I imagine people were more nervous about opening their door to a stranger than they would normally have been.
Yeah, so it's interesting. The group I was with was very COVID cautious, right? Because they really don't want campaigning to be a super spreader event. They don't want, hi, we'd like your votes and also to give you COVID. Right. And they had a bunch of safety protocols in place that I thought made a lot of sense. We were tested, all the time. You had to wear a mask whenever you were having any interaction with a voter. And you had to give a voter a mask, which is a kind of an interesting social thing to navigate. Yeah. Especially because people don't want to talk to you, right? They want to go back to watching The Price is Right or whatever. Yeah. So all of that was interesting and kind of cool.
And is the door knocking, in your experience, is it more directed at sort of get out the vote activities? In other words, you're trying to energize your own base? Or do you, how frequently do you have encounters where you actually think while you're having this conversation, oh, I might actually change this person's mind about who to vote for?
So with that door knocking, it's very much not a matter of changing people's mind. We were going to, largely communities of color or low income communities that had voted, 95% or more for Clinton in 2016. But where the turnout was, single digits, if that. And so our goal was not to get them to vote for Biden. It was just to get them to vote. So in the beginning, in the first, 4 or 5 weeks, we're talking to them about voting and why we're voters. It was a deep canvassing organization, which is sort of this new movement in door knocking that I think is really much more powerful, but also more labor intensive. It's very cool.
So what does deep canvassing mean?
So the idea is you're supposed to really get a conversation going with the voters. And it came out of a LGBTQ rights organization canvassing in California after Prop 8, where they suffered this devastating loss at the polls. And they think, oh my God, our neighbors hate us. And there are videos of this online. It's incredibly powerful to watch these folks go out and door knock and talk to people in precincts that they lost and say, this is an area where I just want to talk to you a little bit about me and about somebody I love. And they would talk about their partner or about a friend who they loved, and then talk about LGBTQ rights. And so what they found is it's not so much, you could see like a policy hook there, right? Like, I love my partner, you love your wife. And so, we're all really the same. So vote for our cause. That is cool, but wasn't the powerful part. The powerful part is if you show up at somebody's door and you talk about someone you love, if you're willing to be vulnerable with them, people will respond to that. Like almost all the time. It can be hard, you're trained, you show up and you start engaging with a voter about something that really matters to you, and you try to open up to the voter and get them to open up back.
So how do you give me an example of how you apply that in the context of a political campaign?
Sure.
You're out there knocking doors for candidate A. How do you, what would be the application of that principle? So
a lot of it depends on what you see when you get to the door. But I would knock on the door and say, oh my God, I see you've got kids. Man, I remember when my daughter was that age. I got to tell you, I love my daughter to death. Let me super quick story about her. And then you tell a story about your daughter and you say, what's your daughter like? What's it like? How's this neighborhood to raise your kid? What does she go to school? What's that like with COVID? And you just ask them questions about their daughter and get them talking. And then you do this pivot where you say, look, it seems like you're a really good parent and you really love your daughter a lot. And I love mine too. And one of the reasons, I'm here for the campaign, right? But one of the reasons I like to vote, one of the reasons I vote every time, one of the reasons I'm a voter is because voting is really one way to sort of shoot a missile into the future.
Right.
To protect my daughter. And when I go to the polls and when I vote, when it's election day, I try not to think about the candidates because, candidates. I think about my daughter. Yeah. And I think about the future I want her to have.
Well, that's great. I mean, look, you're getting me choked
up. Yeah, no, of course.
And
sorry.
I'm like a hard-nosed lawyer, so.
Yeah. But so that's the...
So the idea is you're trying to connect with them on some human level sort of before you get to the pitch.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And at some point, the pitch sort of disappears.
Right.
And then the last few days, it's just voting is really complicated and they make it hard for people who are not as educated and for people who are not as mobile. And so a lot of that was just voter education.
Do you ever just get a surprisingly hostile response that kind of knocks you back on your heels?
All the time.
You got any good stories?
Yeah, there was one where this one. I mean, somebody just saying, "I don't talk to people," and slamming the door. Somebody you just don't, whatever. Right, I don't care. There was one door I was knocking on. And I've spent time in low income neighborhoods, right? I was in this neighborhood where you could just there were a group of guys sitting on the front porch, and I'm convinced they were high. I don't know what they were high on. I just know they were high. And they were all sitting just staring at some indistinct middle point. And I walk up and said, "Hey, how you doing?" And then, one of them looked at me, but they just dead-eyed stared at me. And they wouldn't respond to anything, not to... is this your house? Is it still sunny? Nothing. They just two of them stared at me. The rest stared at the ground. I had no idea what to do with that. Yeah. So then I just walked away. Yeah. Because it was just so weird.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. We had a little retreat at our law firm last week. And at one point in the retreat, we kind of were sitting around a table and we just kind of asked everybody to spend a couple minutes just talking about something, gave them a few prompts or whatever. Like, and one of the lawyers said that they were very kind of shy as, when they were young, kind of introverted. And at some point they sort of made a conscious decision to try to talk to strangers.
Nice.
That, that if they were in a public place and there was somebody standing in line next to them or something like that, that they would kind of try to get over that little and just engage. And that was a very like meaningful experience for them, that they learned a lot from that process of kind of learning how to talk to strangers, and that really sort of like helped them come out of their shell, has helped them in their profession as a lawyer,
sure,
learning how to interact with clients, opposing counsel, lawyers, whatever. And I thought that was really interesting. And I get the sense that maybe there's what do you get out of this? Like, what is you derive some sort of psychological, uplift from this door knocking experience. Like, what do you attribute that to? Like you said, like, it's a very like good, you sort of feel good about that experience of interacting with these people.
Yeah. And it's not necessarily even about the political good, right? Although obviously, you're going to campaign for folks you believe in. There really is. There's just something so human about it. And so kind of, I don't know, like tactile.
Yeah.
And people approach the world in so very different ways. And it's great to get outside of your, like we're in positions of privilege, right? You run a law firm, like I run a law firm. We, both went to fancy schools and speak in a certain way and have a certain facility with ideas and arguments and language. And you go out and you talk to people who don't care about any of that. Mm-hmm. Like none of that's going to move them. Mm-hmm. And I know how to talk to a judge for the most part and try to be persuasive with a judge. But to be persuasive with like a single mom who's got, a bunch of financial stress and a job she's trying to balance and a whole life that I can't even dream of really understanding, to get her talking about that, learn a little bit about that, and then try to figure out how to relate to her as a person so that she's more likely to do what I hope she does. Man, that is a cool challenge.
Yeah. And I think also just in a world that increasingly is dominated by social media and sort of internet interactions, those kinds of one-on-one interactions with strangers happen less and less frequently, it seems to me.
I think that's right.
That's really interesting. Well, this has been a great conversation. I really thank you for coming in. If people want to look you up or find you or chat with you, is there any way that you'd like them to do that?
Yeah, sure. Folks can email me. Just mkaiser@kaiserdillon.com.
Well, that's very brave of you. Are you a Twitter user?
I have a Twitter account, but I'm not a Twitter user.
Okay.
I'm reconciling myself to social media.
Yeah.
Its continued existence.
I have a Twitter account too that I use like once a month. And I haven't figured it out yet. I haven't really figured out what the fun of Twitter is. I find it mostly unfun. But I'll try to learn maybe over time.
It seems like a good way to learn about the most hateful parts of humanity.
Thank God for the internet.
Thank God for the internet.
And you can buy stuff from Jeff Bezos and help him build a rocket. Those are basically the two things you can do on the internet.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that seems as good a place as any to end. So again, thanks for coming in.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Good to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Garrulous Gavel. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to see what we look like when we talk, check out our YouTube channel, also called The Garrulous Gavel. You can always find us at garrulousgavel.com. If you'd like to send feedback or suggest a guest, please contact us at our email address, garrulousgavel@gmail.com, or on Twitter at garrulousgavel. Our cover art was created by artist and illustrator extraordinaire Joan Tico. Our theme music was written and performed by scientist and saxophonist extraordinaire Robert Tico. And our producer is the inimitable K.O. Myers of Particulate Media. See you next episode.